So yes, once again, thank you all for having me, and I'm going to be presenting some of my older work, but I'm presenting it mostly in the context of trying to stimulate the conversation, which is the main point of us being here. And so I'll be talking about it kind of in the light of what we can do with remote sensing, but also what we can't do. And the can't do part is more of maybe we haven't explored some techniques and some fundamental aspects yet, and maybe part of it is also just a fusion of working more with people who are doing field work and combining the remote sensing context with their field-based research so that we are able to expand what we're able to extract from remote sensing. All right. So first, I want to start off with looking at kind of going through a paper that was recently published by Michael Oslin and co-authors about migration and transformation of coastal wetlands and response to rising seas. And I think this paper was extremely timely for this presentation, but also just did a very good job of really showing the vulnerabilities and how they're not uniform across different wetland types. So first, we'll start off by saying that the modeling that they did showed that coastal wetlands, or we may lose coastal wetlands overall. So even though there is migration and shifting that will happen, the amount of land that's currently available to hold wetlands is less than the actual amount of coastal wetlands that we have available. So that's very concerning overall. But as you dig in deeper, you start to see that some wetland types are actually much more vulnerable than others. So freshwater wetlands have a much more limited ability to migrate upslope. And with sea level rise, those that can't migrate upslope are being exposed to saltwater intrusion, which makes it much more suitable for more saline wetlands. So looking at this figure, black bars represent tidal saline migration into freshwater wetlands. The striped bars represent tidal saline migration wetlands into uplands, and then the gray bars represent freshwater wetland migration into uplands. So you can see that there's a lot of land available for saline wetlands to migrate into freshwater wetlands, but when you compare that to the amount of land available for freshwater wetlands to migrate into uplands, it's very, very sparse. And further, you can see that much of that migration potential is kind of concentrated on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And then finally, I know this figure comes out pretty small, but we're all on Zoom, so you can magnify it and put your face closer to the screen. But we want to focus on panel A in the top left here, freshwater forested wetlands. That's like the key to my heart besides food. Talk about one of those topics, I can talk for hours. But the real takeaway here is looking at the vulnerability. So the increasing blueness of a polygon indicates how much of that land area that's occupied by that wetland type that is available or vulnerable for potential wetland migration. So when focusing on panel A, we can see these deep blue areas along the Gulf Coast and the southeast and Atlantic. Those are areas that are currently freshwater forested wetland that are available to be taken over by other wetland types, primarily saline wetlands. And when we look at, kind of briefly look at some of the other wetland categories, there's much less of those areas that are vulnerable to potential migration. So I wanted to start there to kind of set the overall scene, but also let you know that most of this talk is going to focus on freshwater forested wetlands because that's where my experience and knowledge base is. So with that, let's enter the swamp. So the North American coastal plain is this very broad geographic region that occupies much of the southeastern US. It's 1.1 million square kilometers, very large area, been recently kind of proposed as a biodiversity hotspot. And across this large area, there are a diverse set of ecoregions. So we have mangroves, riverine floodplains, salt marshes, coastal forested wetlands, pine savannas, and sawgrass habitats, amongst many others. But despite the variation in vegetation and some geology and kind of abiotic factors, there are multiple threats to coastal vegetation that span this region. So these are sea level rise, storms and droughts, water management, and connectivity. And all of these can lead to salinization of the groundwater, of soils, of surface waters. And very briefly, I want to kind of focus on this saltwater intrusion aspect. Oftentimes when I find myself talking to people who don't study saltwater intrusion, they often think of it as one process or one driver, but there are actually multiple drivers of saltwater intrusion that vary not just on space and time, but also whether it's a natural driver or anthropogenic. So focusing primarily just on the natural right now, we think of things like hurricanes, which happen to be or tend to be rather acute, but don't cover entire continents, at least not yet. Maybe in the future where we have mega hurricanes. So they tend to affect 2 to 3, maybe 4 states at a time. And then when you increase the temporal scale and increase the global scale, we get into things like climate change and natural variations in sea level. And then when we think about the anthropogenic drivers, the temporal and spatial scales are slightly shorter. One, recognizing the fact that humans can engineer the landscape very quickly and do things very quickly, but spatially, we do have some limitation on how much of the landscape we can affect at any given time. So thinking about land drainage, for example, you're probably not going to drain an entire state in a matter of a year, but you may drain a county, for example, or a set up drainage to drain that area in a short amount of time. And so all of these affect coastal, or all of these things affect coastal ecology. And like I said, my experience is primarily in coastal forests, so that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the day. This picture on the right is taken from Beaumont, Texas during the growing season, so during the summer months. You can see this bald cypress tree in the center of the figure. It is very sickly looking. The leaves are yellowed. A lot of the branches don't have leaves. And like I said, it's the growing season where you would expect biomass to be reaching its peak. All of the brown vegetation are dead cattails, and all of the green herbaceous vegetation in the background are sawgrass. Sawgrass is much more salt tolerant than cattail. And so this image, for me, very clearly depicts the effects of salinization on a coastal freshwater forested wetland. And so just to give you some context on the issue of salinity and how kind of finicky these systems can be when it comes to it, the picture on the left shows a healthy system that's experiencing no salinity. And as you increase salinity up to about 4 parts per thousand, that's when you really start to see the die-off of the forested vegetation and the encroachment of saline or halophytes or saltwater-loving or tolerant vegetation. And to put this kind of 4 parts per thousand in context, if you go out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or Gulf of Mexico and sample some water, you're probably going to get about 30 to 35 parts per thousand salinity. So we're not talking about kind of the most saline water that is just sitting on these sites. It's relatively low salinity compared to open water salinity, but that, despite being at that kind of low threshold in total, it's still enough to cause or trigger this ecosystem transition. And this middle figure is a ghost forest, which we're going to talk about next. And ghost forest, I imagine most of you in the audience have heard the term before, but I sometimes talk to people who haven't heard the term, and they often think of a haunted forest, which is not the case. But for me, these ghost forests are haunted in a different way. And I think the ghost forest language is actually pretty good. And so oftentimes when I explain what a ghost forest is to people and I show this image, I like to bring that kind of haunted aspect forward and talk about the fact that these dead gray tree trunks are tombstones, essentially memorializing the forest that once was and the forest that will never be, much like a graveyard does. But this image really captures what a ghost forest is. So we have these dead tree trunks that are left standing from these trees that clearly had been established in this area for a long time and were able to survive and get to those heights and DBHs, but now they're dead, and this area, this landscape is now being taken over by more herbaceous vegetation and more shrub vegetation. So the green vegetation that you see here are more herbaceous shrub, and this image is from coastal North Carolina. And there's been a lot of hay made in the news over the past 4 years about ghost forests. Many of you have been interviewed and in publications about it, so I don't think I really need to spend a whole lot of time there. But I have this slide to say that this is something that has been of interest to scientists for a while, and now it's of growing interest to the public at large. And I think that that very visceral aspect of these ghost forests and these standing dead trees really work to show the salt front that is moving, that oftentimes people can't see it because it's something that's happening underground in most instances, unless you have a storm or a hurricane, something that pushes salt water further inland. So it really helps to visualize what's happening underground through a above ground process. And so the title, From Sauntering Through Swamps to Scanning Satellite Scenes, really represents part of kind of the transition that I've made in my career, my very, feels like nascent career still as a scientist. I started out and went into my PhD, and even as I did field work as an undergrad, it was all in the field, going out, identifying plants, taking soil samples, water quality, things like that. And so that's where most of my research experience really is, and I still like to think of myself as a field ecologist, despite the fact that I am transitioning in some ways. And so where do satellites actually come into all of this? So this image, I made this for my dissertation, and each of these numbers represents a chapter of my dissertation. And so 2/3 of my dissertation were all field-based, biogeochemistry, ecohydrology. But the 5th chapter is the first time that I actually started to pursue remote sensing. And I pursued it because I basically came across a question, I developed a question, and I realized I couldn't really do very well in the field. It's something that I needed at the landscape context. I needed much longer period of record than was available to me through fieldwork. And so this was the beginning of my journey into remote sensing. And to talk about more about why I chose to pursue remote sensing instead of fieldwork, which is where a lot of my experience was, there are a series of trade-offs that I really spent some time thinking about, that I thought remote sensing could allow me to do better than I could do during doing fieldwork. So one of those is just the time component. As I mentioned, oftentimes when you set up a field site, you need 3, 4, 5 years to get some good ecological data and run some regressions and do some modeling. Whereas with remote sensing, particularly when we think about Landsat, we have basically 35 years of Earth sensing. So leveraging that much longer period of record. Remote sensing is fairly cheap. Most times, all you need is a computer. A lot of these data sets like Landsat and MODIS are now publicly available. There are now free online platforms that you can do remote sensing in. So Google Earth Engine, there's also QGIS. And so it's essentially a free way to do research and to do land cover change. Permitting, that's always a hassle, kind of a bureaucratic thing of saying, okay, this is what I want to do. Will you allow me to do it here? And you still have to get permission. And if you get denied, then you have to go find a different site. So that's a whole other process. Maintaining tools and equipment, that's a vital part of field work. And if your research is very sensitive towards equipment, then that's an even bigger headache that you have to handle. You have to often hire people to help do this field work. You have to maintain interest. But I think the thing that was also most critical for me, and this just started to represent a shift in how I do science, is all of my field work was kind of based in a few places. And I kept thinking, how do I extrapolate what I'm finding here to places that I haven't been, or where the geographic abiotic context is slightly different? Will my implications still translate there? And so that's really why I started to hone in even more on remote sensing. Is I wanted the work that I was doing to be translatable and to be useful in many different contexts. Take a quick sip of water. So this image is of the Neches River in Nipomont, Texas. And as it's the same site that I showed before, the surface water here, so in this back channel, is fresh water. But we had groundwater sensors in the swamps to the right and left of us. And the salinity there in the swamps is almost always about 4 parts per thousand, which is very perplexing. And I think for me, that was like a very good experience and a very good thing to learn about. Is this, sometimes there's just a disconnect between surface water hydrology and groundwater hydrology. And you have to oftentimes go a little bit deeper, both literally and figuratively, to really understand the dynamics that are going on. And I think that's, as I'll kind of try and do throughout the presentation, is I think that's one thing that remote sensing kind of lacks at times, is that ability to go beyond the surface, which is oftentimes where we can get that additional context. So having these experiences of going to some place and knowing what's happening on the ground really helped me to understand what I was seeing from a remote sensing perspective. And so I'm going to kind of go over two research questions that I've addressed in previously published work. One, can remotely sense derived data be reliably used to detect the effects of saltwater intrusion on coastal floodplain swamps? So this was one of my dissertation chapters that I did with my advisor, David Kaplan, who I saw in the audience. And it has my affiliation from when I was at UVA, which is when this was published. So as I talked about, I started this work, I started doing this as part of a field-based ecologist, and I knew almost nothing about remote sensing. And so what I really wanted to do was take my knowledge of ecology on the ground and translate that to remote sensing. And so I started to think about what are the differences in canopy during the growing season, and the winter season, and then also what's the difference in the understory, and think about that from an upstream and downstream context. I translated that into these kind of theoretical models of the remote sensing data that I thought I was going to see. And from that, really started to think about what are some hypotheses that I can develop to use to differentiate between the site that's experiencing saltwater intrusion and the site that's not experiencing saltwater intrusion. I won't bore you with the details of the hypotheses. As David could tell you, they're not complex, but they're sometimes hard to say in word and speaking, so it's a bit easier to read the writing. And so we had four sites across the northern Gulf of Mexico. And at those sites, we had been doing field work for several years, so we had a very good understanding of the ground-based context. So this is kind of a brief method slide, but we extracted data, and we had some hydrology that we also used to help contextualize the changes. And so very briefly, the takeaways from this were that the bulk effects of saltwater intrusion were apparent. So we could see shifts in the median value of the data, changes in distribution. But when we really started to pull apart the time series, that's when things really start to get muddled. And that's something that I've been challenging myself more in the remote sensing context, is how do we extract more from these time series? Because as I talked about, this long period of record is where remote sensing really shines. But these time series can oftentimes be very challenging to deal with when you have missing data, you have a long period of cloudy days, and so you have months of no data. And so reconstructing time series and extracting useful information from them is a real challenge of remote sensing that many people are actively working on. But in short, 4 out of my 9 hypotheses were useful in delineating or differentiating between the effects of saltwater, or sites that were affected by saltwater intrusion and sites that weren't affected by saltwater intrusion. And my mental models held up pretty well in general, although there were some challenges here and there. And a major advantage of doing things like remote sensing is that now you can start to monitor the land. So using these set of hypotheses, theoretically, someone could apply their data to these hypotheses and start to understand the effects of saltwater intrusion in their landscape context. So it's the Swanee River. Hopefully all of you have heard of it. Many of you may not have been on it, but it's definitely one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm sad I haven't been there in a very long time. And my last research question, which kind of steps us back out to this much broader scale, is what's the spatiotemporal distribution of coastal forested wetland loss in the North American coastal plain? And so this is work that I did with Emily Urey, who's here, and Bernhardt and Shi Yang, and this is during my time as a postdoc at UVA. So this was part of an interdisciplinary project. The group that I was with, we're looking at coastal salinization in the vegetation context, but we also were working with people looking at the effects of climate change in the coastal context on urban water systems and also water security, justice, and politics. And so as Emily and she and I really started to talk about what we want to do, we started to resonate on these coastal forested wetlands. And what I first did was think about where are people doing this type of research. So the stars represent places where people are doing this type of work, and the bigger the star, kind of the more research that's going on there. So we thought, okay, people are doing this work across this entire region, but the question that really came up was, how much do we actually know? And these stars are obviously massively overrepresenting the land area. So despite the fact that people are doing work across this region, there's still a lot of gaps in our actual knowledge. And so what we decided to do was leverage existing data in this context. So this data is from the NOAA Coastal Change Analysis Program, and it's a product that's produced every 5 years that maps the entire coastline in the US and has 26 different land cover classes, 6 of those being wetland types. And it's a really great way to look at wetland change over time from a remote sensing perspective. So this is an image of New Orleans that I put in here to kind of give you a sense of the land cover classes that are here. So these gray/white colors are urban development. These deeper kind of magenta colors are saltwater marshes. And these green colors are what I'm most interested in. These are palustrine forested wetlands. So as I said, the main questions that we have are where are the changes occurring? What's the fate of areas that have changed? So if you transition from this wetland type, what are you actually transitioning into? And then what's the continuity of the landscape after change? And so the big high level takeaway is that between 1996 and 2016, there's a net loss of over 13,000 square kilometers of coastal forested wetland, much of that being focused in the southeastern Atlantic and also along the Gulf Coast. These losses are primarily driven by climate change and topography, which is what we expected, but the fact that just using 5 variables, we're able to explain 78% of the variation across these watersheds that had the most loss was surprising in some ways. And then finally, or not finally, but the trajectory of change matches what we have known in the ecological literature for a while. So we have this kind of transition arc into palustrine scrub shrub, freshwater marsh, and then to open water. But what was very great for us to realize is that not a lot of this transition is into agriculture or urban areas, which would represent kind of a direct anthropogenic effect. And that was critical because historically, this landscape type has been converted into urban areas and agriculture, but that's not the case now. So that once again kind of resonates with the fact that these climate change is actually driving much of what we're seeing. And then finally, when we think about fragmentation of the landscape, this is an image of Palmetto Pear Tree Preserve in North Carolina. 1996, green areas are forests and gray areas are not forests, and the red outline is the boundary of the preserve. And as we go into 2017, your eyes will immediately notice these big patches of forest loss. But what was actually most striking for us were these areas more in the interior. So if we focus in this area here, which is about over here, you'll see that there's a patch of loss there. And as you look more, you'll see that there are more patches of losses in the interior than you would expect. And the thing to really focus on are these linear features. So you have this linear feature here, which is almost certainly a road. And in these coastal contexts, roads almost always have a canal next to them to help with drainage and stability. But these canals are actually allowing for saltwater intrusion or saltwater to intrude much further inland than they would be able to do on their own if they had to actually, the saltwater had to actually push through the soil matrix. And so human engineering on the landscape is actually aiding saltwater intrusion and causing these transitions to go a lot faster. So as we kind of get to the end, I made this transition in my career very unconsciously. I just followed the questions from a field ecologist, and now I've become more of a map maker, which I enjoy still. And the reason I think I've really started to resonate with the power of maps is that we can center on them and use them as part of a communication collaboration tool. So we can take ecological data, socioeconomic data, or really any other data layer that you can represent geospatially, and stack them on top of one another. And now you have the ability to understand how this pixel, and a pixel is just a spot, a place on land, how that place on land has these many different contexts that are important. And we can start to think about those interactions in a spatial context. And then once again, with the power of remote sensing, we oftentimes can go much further back in history than we can if we only were doing the space and field work. So I'll give a quick plug for my lab. I'm always looking for new students. We have two kind of questions that guide the research that I really want to do is how are coastal land ecological integrity and climate change continuity being disrupted by global climate change? And then two, what are the inequities that marginalized communities face through the impacts of global climate change? Hopefully I haven't put anyone to sleep, but I have definitely managed to put people to sleep after field work. It's very exhausting stuff that I do sometimes. And then finally, we have to continue to diversify the sciences, and progress takes sustained effort. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Elliott. We have a few minutes for questions directed at Dr. White before we start asking questions to each other, if anybody has anything they want to ask now.
Okay, I'll bite so we don't have the awkward silence. Hi, Elliott. Thank you for a nice talk. I always get asked, and I bet you do too, and I want to know your answer. What can forests tell us about people?
Wow, yeah, I don't think I've been asked that question before. What can forests tell us about people? Yeah, I think you've actually managed to stump me, which is
okay, sorry, I wasn't trying to stump you. I was thinking, you know, when we think about how we connect people in this environment, you sort of showed one example, right? The canals, but also like we can see ghost forests from space. There's lots of things we can't see from space. What are ghost forests an indicator of, and what are they not an indicator of? Maybe it's a better question.
Yeah, that's so. As you started talking, I was like, okay, I think I know where she's going with this. So yeah, as I talked about, these ghost forests are an extremely visual representation of saltwater intrusion, essentially. And so, because oftentimes we don't have this giant network of groundwater sensors, they're a great way to understand where the salt front is. And that's really critical as we start to think about all the buried infrastructure that we have in coastal regions. So we think about septic tanks that people have. Sometimes they don't even know where they're at, but they know they have a septic tank. They don't know if it's leaking. We think about water transportation systems. So all the pipes and stuff that we have underground that were not necessarily designed to be sitting in saltwater for 50 years. And so I think there's a whole underground component of salinization that we don't characterize very well because people just didn't think about the fact that saltwater will be in these places so quickly. And so I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about these ghost forests and these coastal forests in general, is that these are sites that are fairly sensitive to salinity, as I discussed. And so those transitions represent many other transitions that will likely happen within communities as well.
Thanks. Larry, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Elliott, thanks very much for a really interesting synthesis. A lot of the coast in forest, of course, is privately held. I'm not sure if you've quantified how much is actually privately held and how much is in rotation forestry. So as an example, when you showed that coastal area on the Carolina on the Sounds, although we're seeing some forest loss, we're also seeing some forestry growth. Mm-hmm. So partially related to Emily's questions, what are these forests telling us about people? How much area is in rotation? How much of that area in rotation is actually being lost? So can you break out the amount of loss by land use, and specifically forest land use? There's a lot of national forest, but there's also an awful lot of private land in rotation.
Yeah, and that, as we were writing that paper, that was something that we did spend time thinking about. And part of the challenge was like a geospatial challenge is those shapefiles, those boundaries aren't always publicly available. And so it's something I could definitely do now, is kind of go back and get whatever information is available about private land ownership, et cetera, and start to pull out what is partitioned into different categories, but that is a limitation that we have, is that we don't always know what is public or private based on just looking at the landscape, and even sometimes digging those boundaries and who owns what are not immediately available for public knowledge. And so that is a limitation of this type of work, is that we don't always have that on the ground based knowledge at such a very large scale.
Yeah, so this is an important point that you're raising. There's a layer of information we need, and unfortunately, it's extremely heterogeneous getting the parcel level data. And so parcel level data, ownership and activity.
Yeah, and I will say part of the motivation of looking at change in these conservation, and that one of those conservation areas, was to show that the rates of change in those conservation areas are similar to the rates of change at the broader landscape overall. And so while land rotation and forestry practices are probably captured in what we're showing, the fact that those types of land transitions weren't significant enough to give a different rate of change compared to these private lands indicates that overall this kind of climate change and topographic effect is really what we're seeing across the landscape. And these rotations are kind of potentially a minor part of this overall transition sequence.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, David, we're going to start asking each other questions, but I am going to say that Elliott is available via email. At the last 5 minutes of today, we'll open up for maybe some more questions for each other and for Dr. Elliott White.
Yeah.
But for thinking about the discussion with each other, we're going to be talking about data and what we can use to measure and talk about coastal vulnerability. So I am going to share the Jamboard right now. We're using Jamboard again, and I will open the rooms in just a moment, but I do want to share my screen to talk through the Jamboard itself. So this is the Jamboard for our third SWISLR webinar. We are going to talk about data. And so this first frame is an example of what we're going to do. I want you to first spend some time introducing each other, introducing everybody in your group, but then talk about, if there were no limits, if you could measure anything, what would you want to measure? What would you want to map to show coastal vulnerability to SWISLR? And then the next question after that is, after thinking about what we want to see, is what can we actually measure? So putting those limits onto that we do have onto what we want. So what do you currently have or are aware of, or what do you know of proxies that you could measure, potentially measure what we want? And then the last question to kind of tie it all together is, do you have any examples for us? Any examples of a good synthesis map? So I will share the Jamboard again once I open all the rooms. Your room should be named the frame that we want you to go to. So if you expand the frame bar, they're all labeled frame 3, 4, 5, 6, so on. And I will open all the rooms and have fun discussing. Back. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for taking part in this discussion as well. I know that our group talked a lot about the influence of kind of economics, the importance of collecting information on soil salinity, information on carbon emissions, and we had someone who is working a lot with topographic data, which was really interesting. And so I hope that these conversations were helpful in kind of sparking ideas. And I will be looking through all of these boards in the next week to kind of get an idea and almost a list of information that we have available to us. And if you all have more ideas, if I cut the conversation short, I invite you to continue to edit this discussion board. Please don't delete any sticky notes, but feel free to add as much as you want. And I know we only have 1 minute left before the top of the hour. So if you have any questions for Elliott, you can always email me and I can relay the information to him. But thank you all for joining, and thank you again, Dr. Elliott White, for talking to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Yeah, peace out.
Good to see you.